and especially from my side.
The missiles were launched from Belarus.
There's no need to expect any military action.
It's either them or us. I think a week will be enough for him.
30 pages of solid evidence. That's how much the Belarusian opposition needed to expose what Lukashenko had been hiding for years. While the dictator was publicly swearing neutrality, Belarus, and especially from my side, there's no reason to expect any military action. His regime was quietly and methodically preparing the country for a full-scale war. The army grew by 1.5 times, and the defense budget increased 5-fold. On the border with Ukraine, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and concrete barriers are being urgently constructed. And on Belarusian soil, nuclear warheads and missiles are already stationed, missiles the enemy can use to strike our cities. And this is far from the first time we've been promised one thing, while something completely different is done behind our backs.
When the full-scale war began, we were attacked by missiles. They killed children, adults, a large number, as you know. The missiles were launched from Belarus, from his country. And back then he also called to apologize, saying he wasn't in control of it. Russia was acting on its own territory.
This dossier was officially submitted to the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs this week. And it was after this that Zelenskyy completely abandoned diplomatic language. Why did Kyiv issue a tough public ultimatum to Lukashenko? What exactly is in that report, and why does it change everything? And why did Putin personally get involved in this conversation? Let's break it down right now. Let's start with what became the starting point of this major escalation. On June 19th, Zelenskyy made a statement at a press conference that surprised everyone. Not a closed phone conversation, not a diplomatic note, but a public ultimatum in front of the cameras.
On his territory, along 2 regions bordering Ukraine, there is equipment that is adjusting fire on the Ukrainian population. Specifically the population. Right now, we don't have such a strong front there between Ukraine and Belarus. Civilians are being killed there. There are retransmitters on the respective towers there. Can he remove them? What's the point of saying he doesn't want to be involved in the war? Let him remove this equipment, let him turn it off. I think a week would be enough for him to do this.
10 days, not a month of negotiations, not another note of protest. A specific deadline and a concrete action. And this is despite the fact that Ukraine has already reached out to Minsk more than once, not publicly, through intelligence, through the security service of Ukraine at the military level. The result was 0, which is why a public deadline was set. But why did the Ukrainian president switch to the language of open ultimatums? After all, a public threat is always a serious escalation. The answer was given in an interview with TSN on June 21st.
Question. Since this was conveyed to them repeatedly, we move to the stage of a public signal. This means that if he doesn't remove it, we will. That's it. What will happen in a week? Either they do it or we do.
It turns out that Kyiv had repeatedly reached out to Minsk non-publicly through the intelligence channels of the SBU and at the military level. The Belarusian side regularly received a clear signal: stop helping the Russians. However, there was no response at all. That is why Zelenskyy decided to act more radically. In other words, this step is not the start of a dispute, but the final warning before concrete action. And this is a key point. The head of state also added that Lukashenko's latest apologies, which he made in mid-June during an interview with an Arab media outlet, no longer interest anyone. According to Zelenskyy, besides words, Minsk must demonstrate real de-escalation, and an empty sorry hasn't worked since the very first day of the full-scale invasion. This is a matter of principle because it was in February 2022 that Belarus became a staging ground for the offensive on Kyiv, after which any statements about neutrality completely lost their significance. In parallel with the demand to remove the equipment, an insider report appeared on the Telegram channel of Mykolaiv Defense Forces representative Mykola Vanko, which adds more depth to this picture. It turned out that Ukraine had already taken decisive action. Russian equipment on Belarusian territory had already been successfully neutralized once before, without any unnecessary noise or official reports. In other words, the problem did not arise just yesterday, and it was brought into the public sphere only because secret diplomacy and covert operations had exhausted their resources. Here, it's worth looking at the broader context of events. In his evening address on June 20th, Zelenskyy emphasized that Belarus has increased its support for Russia 13-fold.
Every factory in Belarus that works for Russia is working for this war. Every single enterprise that supplies components for Russian weapons, for armored vehicles, for missile systems, as well as those enterprises that supply Russia with fuel for the war, this is all drawing Belarus into the war. Ukraine does not want this, and we have actually warned the leadership of Belarus, which influences the relevant events.
The president's words that Ukraine knows about every such enterprise clearly indicate the existence of a serious body of evidence. Moscow responded to these inconvenient facts in a predictable way through Dmitry Peskov. On June 22nd, the Kremlin spokesperson called Ukraine's demands aggressive and started talking about the inadmissibility of interfering in the affairs of sovereign states. When a representative of the aggressor country reflects on respect for sovereignty, further commentary seems unnecessary. However, Peskov also let slip that Vladimir Putin will soon meet with Lukashenko to discuss the situation. This clearly demonstrates that the fate of the relays will be decided in Moscow, which eloquently speaks to the true independence of the Minsk dictator. While the topic of technical guidance systems dominates the information space, another significant event took place behind the scenes. The Belarusian opposition handed over a comprehensive 30-page dossier to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. On June 22nd, the deputy head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, Pavel Latushko, personally handed this report to the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, during his visit to Kiev. The title of the document speaks for itself: the systematic preparation of the Lukashenko regime for a possible entry into the war on Russia's side, and recommendations on how to prevent this scenario. The report describes in detail 8 indicators of high combat readiness. These are not just analysts' assumptions, but documented processes. Firstly, since 2022, Belarus has completely rewritten its legislation. Now their troops have the legal right to carry out preemptive strikes in the event of an alleged buildup of forces near the borders. In other words, they have already created a legal basis for launching a first strike. Secondly, over the past 4 years, the size of the Belarusian army has increased by 1.5 times, mainly due to contract soldiers. In addition, the training of reservists has intensified, with their number reaching 290,000 people. That's more than the entire population of a city like Poltava. In addition, a southern operational command with up to 80,000 troops was specially formed for the Ukrainian direction. From 2022 to 2025, funding for the defense sector soared 5-fold to 4.6 billion Belarusian rubles, which is approximately $1.5 billion annually. The local defense industry has now completely merged with the Russian one. In 2024 alone, 4,000 new types of weaponry were registered there. Moreover, Wagner mercenaries are still stationed in Belarus. Russian nuclear warheads and Oreshnik launchers, the very same missiles that recently attacked Dnipro, are also deployed there. Special attention should be paid to the so-called Krinin Line, named after the Belarusian Minister of Defense. It is a deep network of 3 fortified areas along the Ukrainian border, consisting of ditches, trenches, and concrete dragon's teeth. And here a logical question arises. If you regularly claim that you have no intention of fighting, why launch large-scale construction of fortifications precisely on the border with a country with which you supposedly have no conflicts? In addition, Belarus has stockpiled an untouchable reserve of fuel for a month in advance. They passed laws allowing the seizure of civilian vehicles for military needs and prepared the medical sector by approving rules for triaging the wounded and setting up 5,000 shelters. Even children's camps have been turned into centers of militarization with elements of military training. The report also contains clear recommendations on how to counter these threats. However, this final section is completely classified, blacked out with stripes. The plan to deter Lukashenko is already on the table of Ukrainian diplomats, although its details remain undisclosed. If you put all these elements together into a single puzzle, what emerges is a state that is systematically expanding its military infrastructure, accumulating resources, accepting the nuclear arsenal of its ally, and at the same time continues to speak about its neutral status. We see relay stations that guide Russian attack drones to Ukrainian homes, as well as massive flows of fuel for the occupying forces. At the same time, Lukashenko himself is balancing between belated apologies and stories about the existence of secret coordinate targets in Ukraine. The final date of Zelenskyy's ultimatum is Friday, June 26th. If by that day Minsk does not independently remove the military equipment, Ukraine reserves the right to resolve this issue by its own means. Putin is urgently preparing for negotiations with the Belarusian dictator, while the Kremlin dryly comments that Minsk is capable of defending its own sovereignty. Although, what kind of sovereignty are we talking about when such decisions are made under direct orders from Moscow? Tensions have reached their peak and the week is rapidly coming to an end. That's all for today. What do you think? Will Lukashenko dare to fulfill the terms of the ultimatum by Friday? Or will he once again try to get away with empty promises? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video informative, support the channel by liking and subscribing so you don't miss the next analytical breakdowns. See you in the next episodes.